as we finally leave the fragile safety of Earth behind and press outward into the deep dark of the solar system. The massive planet Jupiter looms large in our ship viewports. It is absolutely nothing like what you think it is. We are out here learning how to survive in the freezing void. And the first brutal lesson is that almost everyone is entirely wrong about Jupiter. Forget everything you were taught in school about this celestial behemoth, because almost all of it is simply incorrect. It is not a giant, peaceful, floating ball of gas. We are actually looking at a churning, violent liquid planet, and as if that wasn't terrifying and strange enough on its own, we now know it is actually a liquid metal planet. Beneath those iconic, swirling painted clouds lies one of the deepest, most dangerous mysteries of our entire solar system. So today, as we drift closer to its crushing gravity well, you and I are going to dive in and uncover the truth together. It is incredibly hard to believe that this grainy image is the very first close-up photograph of Jupiter ever taken by our human ancestors. It was captured by a brave, tiny NASA spacecraft called Pioneer 11 all the way back in the year 1974, long before we ever dreamed of actually building habitats out here in the black. And this next archival file is the very first moving picture of Jupiter ever recorded by human hands. It is a stunning, mesmerizing time-lapse of images captured by the legendary Voyager, one probe as it blindly approached the giant in the year 1979. Now, the main problem with these early, desperate observations is that beyond looking really cool and inspiring a whole generation of spacefarers, they do not provide us with any real, tangible answers about the true nature of this terrifying, beautiful gas giant. Those old, flickering images only raise far more haunting questions, like what exactly is this colossal thing actually made of, and how in the universe did it manage to get so impossibly big out here, staring at it through the reinforced glass of our new orbital home. The actual physical size of Jupiter is very difficult to even comprehend. Not only is it overwhelmingly big, but its mass is substantially heavier than the combined weight of every single other planet in our solar system put together. It essentially takes up enough space in the dark void to effortlessly fit 1,000 entire Earths inside its hungry belly. Let me give you a more relatable sense of scale to hold on to while we float out here in the deep black. If the beautiful blue planet Earth we just left behind was roughly the size of a single green grape, then this monster, Jupiter, would be the size of a massive, heavy basketball. Now, our general working theory for how the violent early solar system actually came to be starts with a massively chaotic, swirling disk of heavy rock, sharp metal, freezing gas, and thick dust, with all of this ancient stuff relentlessly spinning wildly around the blinding, furious light of our newly formed sun. And then, over the agonizing course of millions of years, all of the raw materials and floating debris in that fiery disk kept violently smashing together, eventually fusing and forming into much bigger, heavier chunks of planetary matter. And then, as those rocky chunks got even bigger and increasingly dense, the inescapable, crushing force of gravity started to finally kick in, reaching out into the dark to aggressively attract even more wandering material. So under that specific historical theory, our menacing neighbor Jupiter would have originally formed when just one of those floating rocky chunks got so unbelievably massive that its newborn gravity started greedily capturing enormous, swirling amounts of primordial gas. This cold gas was already swirling around chaotically inside the crowded solar disk. and the growing planet just kept aggressively eating that material for billions of years until it finally became the terrifying, beautiful behemoth that we are looking at through our viewports today. That logical progression completely makes sense to our human minds, and if it were true, it would definitively mean that deep inside Jupiter, buried under the storms, there simply must be a very big and incredibly dense, heavy core forged entirely out of solid rock and crushed metal. But there is an alternative, slightly more terrifying theory that we pioneers talk about on the ship just for fun, which suggests that Jupiter actually started its violent life as a completely separate, gigantic cloud of freezing gas. This cloud was quietly sitting just outside the chaotic, swirling borders of the early solar system, watching us form over an immense stretch of time. That isolated cloud got so incredibly big and heavy in the dark that it eventually collapsed completely inward, under the overwhelming weight of its own immense gravity, and violently formed into a super dense, churning ball of thick, suffocating gas. This cosmic process is actually pretty much the exact same way that a blazing, radiant star is formed out in the deep cosmos. The only real difference is that actual stars desperately need a much, much bigger cloud of gas to get their nuclear fires officially started. So in this specific planetary case, you just end up with a really big, failed star of a planet. And then eventually, that massive new wandering world got aggressively pulled in by the immense, inescapable gravity of the blazing sun and forced to finally settle down into a permanent, looping orbit where we find it today. If this frightening origin story were actually true, then Jupiter really would not have a solid planetary core at all. It would just be exactly like a tremendously big, bottomless layer cake of swirling, suffocating gas. But the comforting, neat theory that most of us were taught back in our safe classrooms on Earth was the one about the big, solid rock core that patiently captured all of the surrounding gas, and again, staring out into the endless void. That theory really does make total logical sense to our survival-wired brains. It is certainly not a crazy, irrational thing to believe, but it is also completely, undeniably incorrect. Our very first real scientific breakthrough with finally understanding the terrifying true nature of Jupiter actually came in the mid-1990s, and this particular historical event is one of those insane, cosmic coincidences that honestly sounds way too good to be true, even to those of us living out here among the stars. But in July of 1995, this massive giant of a planet was violently hit by a rogue comet. This is definitely not a common, everyday occurrence in our quiet solar neighborhood. It is roughly estimated by our shipboard computers that a massive, catastrophic collision like this violent, apocalyptic impact might only happen once every 6,000 years, but humanity was incredibly lucky enough to be around to see this exact one happen, and we actually had the primitive but highly functional early technology to watch the whole terrifying event unfold from afar. This famous, world-shaking comet was dramatically named Shoemaker-Levy 9, and it was a very big, jagged chunk of ancient frozen ice and hard rock hurtling blindly through the dark solar system at 216,000 kilometers per hour. It is incredibly hard to confidently say how genuinely massive the doomed, speeding comet really was initially, because by the time our sky-watching ancestors desperately found it in the black, the overwhelmingly powerful, crushing gravity of Jupiter had already aggressively fractured the icy object into a couple dozen shattered pieces. Even so, the largest of those flying, jagged fragments was still measuring around 2 kilometers across, large enough to end an entire world. And at this exact, pivotal point in human history, the brilliant pioneers at NASA luckily had their newly operational Hubble Space Telescope completely ready to eagerly observe the incoming impact from a safe distance in Earth's orbit. But there was a really big, deeply frustrating problem staring them in the face. The shattered pieces of the speeding comet were definitive going to hit Jupiter on its hidden far side, completely out of view from the terrified watchers back on Earth. We were going to completely miss the main event of the millennium. Except, stick with me here, because at the exact same miraculous time that this once-in-a-6,000-year destructive event was actually happening in the dark, NASA just also happened to have a lonely little spacecraft successfully arriving right at Jupiter's doorstep. This brave, fragile little machine is the legendary probe Galileo, proudly named after the very first human astronomer to have ever studied the massive giant planet through a primitive glass telescope. The robotic probe was originally launched back in 1989 on a truly daring mission to deeply investigate Jupiter and its freezing, desolate moons, perhaps laying the groundwork for the very colonization efforts we are living today. It was officially scheduled to finally arrive in December of 1995, and now it incredibly had a perfectly clear, terrifyingly front-row view on its lonely approach of the massive comet impact. What the tiny mechanical explorer actually saw with its mechanical eyes was 21 totally separate, apocalyptic collisions over the terrifying course of 6 long days. The largest single chunk of the shattered comet violently unleashed the terrifying equivalent energy of roughly 300 million atomic bombs, instantly making it the absolute biggest, most violent explosion ever caught on human camera, as the massive wounded planet slowly rotated around in the cold dark. The distant Hubble Space Telescope was finally able to clearly see the horrifying aftermath of those brutal, world-shaking strikes they actually left behind. These immensely big, bruised black holes torn right into the thick swirling clouds, and they violently kicked up massive, terrifying plumes of glowing planetary debris. These dark scars were thousands of kilometers high and lingered ominously above Jupiter's stormy surface for many dark months, and this exact apocalyptic burning scene is precisely what the fragile Galileo spacecraft finally arrives at in the freezing void. The completely hidden, ancient insides of Jupiter have literally been kicked violently out into the freezing vacuum of deep space, and the tiny, fearless probe is miraculously able to fly right directly through those glowing plumes of deep planetary guts. This gives humanity our very first, truly breathtaking look at exactly what is hiding underneath the thick, impenetrable cloud layer that fragile people down on Earth have been staring up at in sheer wonder for hundreds and hundreds of years. The absolute most interesting, mind-bending thing that the Galileo probe found floating out there in the debris was actually water, a whole lot of completely unexpected liquid water, and the brilliant observing scientists back home quickly thought that was pretty incredibly weird to find out here. It was weird enough, in fact, that they immediately started furiously working on entirely another daring mission to return to Jupiter. This time, they built a brand new, highly advanced probe that would be designed specifically to seek out and uncover the giant planet's true, terrifying nature. That historic, groundbreaking second mission was proudly named Juno. The sleek spacecraft was launched from a still green Earth in 2011, and it successfully arrived in 2016 to finally begin bravely solving the deep, crushing mystery hidden violently within Jupiter's impenetrable heavy core, so you might be wondering. The same exact thing I did when I first looked out these reinforced viewports into the abyss, when we boldly state that absolutely everything you were ever taught in school about this monster planet is completely wrong, that is, specifically because humanity did not even really start to learn the actual terrifying truth until this past recent decade. So here is exactly what your well-meaning science teacher simply did not know at the time they were writing on the chalkboard. Jupiter is completely not made of gas. It is deceptively covered in big, intensely thick clouds of freezing gas that brilliantly form all of those beautiful, mesmerizing swirling rings and violent, continent-sized storms that we watch from the observation deck. But those pretty shifting clouds are really just a shockingly thin, fragile layer painted loosely on top of much stranger, far more terrifying things lurking deep down below in the pressurized dark. But let's start our imaginary descent from the very top. Up high in the outer clouds of Jupiter, the ambient temperature is brutally below negative 100 degrees Celsius. Out here, jagged water ice crystals violently interact with thick ammonia, which naturally acts as a bizarre chemical antifreeze, miraculously allowing freezing liquid water to somehow exist in the upper freezing cloud layer, even in the dead of space. As these heavy chemical droplets brutally collide with the jagged ice crystals in the violent, howling winds, the massive cloud banks become heavily electrified. This friction actively triggers gigantic, world-shattering lightning storms that relentlessly rage all across the entire visible surface of the angry planet. This super-chilled, chaotic mixture of raw water and toxic ammonia eventually clings tightly together in the dark, forming massive, slushy hailstones that fall heavily down into the darker, much more dangerous lower atmosphere, where they violently melt into a heavy, torrential alien rain, quickly evaporate in the rising internal heat, and then furiously rise back up into the freezing void to start the apocalyptic process all over again. These aggressive, howling jets of intensely hot gas that forcefully rise up from the unseen depths to fuel the raging, swirling storms on the visible surface actually reach incredibly deep down into the crushing bowels of the planet's thick atmosphere. This violent, churning, unending cycle is exactly what we are seeing when we stare in silent awe at the famous Great Red Spot. Not only is this monstrous, beautiful storm thousands of terrifying kilometers in sheer, unbroken diameter, but it also aggressively extends down hundreds of blindingly dark kilometers deep into the violent, crushing ammonia rain. The massive, swirling red spot actually reaches up much higher into the black void than any other surrounding clouds on Jupiter, literally extending far above the normal surface level and directly absorbing significantly more harsh, unshielded ultraviolet light from our distant sun. This intense, unfiltered solar radiation then violently reacts with the exotic, toxic chemical compounds churning inside the furious storm and uniquely creates that deep, menacing, bruised red color that looks exactly like a giant, unblinking eye staring back at us in the dark. Just try to honestly imagine an angry, howling storm cloud 10 times taller than the snowy peak of Mount Everest, and somehow 10 times deeper than the absolute blackest bottom of the Mariana Trench back on Earth. And the craziest part is that scale still would not even be nearly big enough to accurately capture the true, terrifying size of the massive red spot. As undeniably spectacular and beautiful as this violent outer layer might boldly appear from our ship windows, the actual average depth of these swirling ammonia and water clouds is only around a mere 50 kilometers. as we mentally descend down well below those terrifying outer storms and push blindly into the suffocating, pitch-black lower atmosphere of Jupiter. The ambient temperature violently begins to rise to absolutely lethal levels. This intense, unearthly heat is entirely caused by the sheer, crushing physical pressure of the giant planet. When you forcefully compress billions of molecules into a suffocatingly tight space, you massively concentrate their kinetic energy. And all of this unyielding, fatal pressure is relentlessly created by the simple, inescapable pull of gravity, the truly incredible, world-breaking mass of the planet itself is endlessly pulling all of this heavy, swirling atmospheric material aggressively down toward the center and viciously squeezing it tighter and tighter until some really, genuinely weird, physics-breaking stuff begins to happen in the unseen dark. The much further down we hypothetically go into Jupiter's inescapable, crushing gravity well, the exponentially more the brutal heat and fatal pressure actively build up all around us, threatening to crush any ship. It is exactly like traveling blindly through a thick, glowing, wet fog that rapidly becomes heavier, thicker, and thicker until eventually, impossibly, it completely becomes a churning, heavy liquid, except down here in the crushing, blinding blackness, the fog isn't made of familiar water at all. It is entirely made of pure hydrogen. Hydrogen is famously known to us as the absolute lightest, most basic element in the entire universe. And in an extreme, totally unforgiving gravity environment, exactly like the terrifying inside of Jupiter, it is the absolute only physical thing that can somehow manage to magically stay afloat in the immense, crushing chaos. All of the other, naturally heavier planetary elements have already been aggressively pulled straight down into the blackness of the planet's hidden, unreachable core long ago. At a terrifying depth of roughly 1,000 kilometers directly below the stormy cloud layer, we safely observe from orbit the violently compressed hydrogen gas forcefully completes its impossible transition into a permanent heavy liquid state, and this alien sloshing boundary is absolutely the closest we spacefarers will ever get to finding anything that might vaguely resemble the actual surface of Jupiter. It is a massive, roiling, endless ocean of pure liquid hydrogen. It is undoubtedly the largest ocean in the entire solar system, and gazing at it makes the deep blue, comforting seas of Earth look like mere evaporating puddles. So, while the giant planet we are currently orbiting might beautifully appear to be completely covered by a thin, painted shell of swirling gas, it is most definitely not made of gas on the inside. It is fundamentally a massive, terrifying liquid planet hiding in plain sight. But make no mistake, this is a far, far stranger, much more intensely hostile liquid than absolutely anything humanity has ever encountered before in our entire history of exploration. Back on Earth, we can safely liquefy volatile hydrogen by simply making it very cold. The normal, gentle atmospheric pressure of Earth easily lowers the natural boiling point of hydrogen to a freezing roughly negative 250 degrees, but down here in the hellish, crushing belly of Jupiter, the exact opposite terrifying effect is actively going on. We are about to uncover the true, violent nature of this beast together. The unimaginably intense physical pressure artificially raises the chemical boiling point so unbelievably high that the hydrogen can impossibly exist as a sloshing heavy liquid, even at blistering temperatures well over 1,000 degrees. This impossible burning ocean of liquid fuel is roughly 20,000 kilometers insanely deep, extending into the abyss, making it roughly 1,000 entire times deeper than Earth's deepest, darkest, most terrifying ocean, and as our minds finally reach the absolute, crushing bottom of this alien sea, the apocalyptic pressure and blazing temperature relentless, lie created by the inescapable gravity, will have a very bizarre, frankly terrifying effect on the chemistry down there. Under millions of times the normal atmospheric pressure of Earth's gentle, life-giving surface, at a staggering 10,000 degrees Celsius, the compressed hydrogen magically changes its physical state into something entirely new, called metallic hydrogen. Now that concept does not mean that the hydrogen instantly turns into a hard, unyielding solid like a heavy block of forged steel. Let's look at this last piece of the puzzle carefully together. It is still a flowing liquid down there in the dark, but it is incredibly now a heavy metallic liquid. It behaves maybe something exactly like the silver mercury you would find trapped inside of an old, vintage glass thermometer. The single biggest, most important chemical chain that dramatically takes place in this hellscape is that the new metallic hydrogen now possesses the terrifying ability to fully conduct raw electricity. Jupiter's massive gravity physically squeezes everything so incredibly tightly down here that the very electrons, as we drift past the swirling storms of this gas giant, leaving the safety of Earth far behind us, you and I have to understand what is happening just beneath those clouds. The pressure down there is so violent that it rips electrons right off their hydrogen atoms. They flow freely through the dark, generating a massive electric current. This churning ocean of liquid metallic hydrogen makes up almost the entirety of the planet's interior, plunging down an unfathomable 40,000 kilometers. And somewhere at the very bottom of that crushing abyss lies what we always thought was the solid core of Jupiter. At least, that is what the old textbooks back on Earth told us. But out here in the void, survival means accepting new realities. Before we built the orbital tethers and finally left our home world, the brightest minds back on Earth believed there was a compact, highly dense object hiding in the center of Jupiter. They pictured a sphere roughly the size of the world we just abandoned, forged out of solid iron and rock. It made perfect mathematical sense at the time, but now that we are actually out here, looking at the raw telemetry pouring into our ship's databanks, the truth is far more unnerving. The core is not a neat little sphere. It is completely fuzzy. The scanners show that the transition between the churning liquid metal ocean and the deepest center is not a hard line at all. The layers just bleed into one another in a chaotic, unending storm of crushing pressure. Looking at the diagnostic screens in the command module, the sheer scale of this fuzzy core is absolutely monstrous. It stretches across nearly half of the entire radius of the giant planet. There is no solid ground to stand on down there, no familiar geology like the continents we left behind. Instead, it is nothing but a massive, superheated soup of liquid gas, molten rock, and crushed metal. Everything is violently stirred together in the absolute dark, with absolutely no boundary to tell you where one state of matter ends and the next nightmare begins. As we try to learn how to live in this harsh frontier, staring down into that bottomless, churning cauldron is a stark reminder of just how alien the rest of the solar system truly is. The question that keeps our planetary engineers awake at night is whether this terrifying structure is completely unique to Jupiter, or if every gas giant out here hides a similar abyss. We have not pointed our deep space probes toward Saturn enough yet to know for sure. As our fleet pushes further into the dark, we might find that this chaotic, molten blender of a core is totally normal for the outer rim, but if it is unusual, the leading theory is catastrophic. Our navigators suspect this. Broken core is the scar of a monumental collision that took place during the violent early days of the solar system, long before humanity ever took its first breath, let alone built ships to sail the stars. Picture a rogue rocky planet, something easily 10 times the size of the Earth we just said goodbye to, drifting blindly through the primordial void. Out of nowhere, it slams headfirst into a young Jupiter in an impact so devastating it shatters the mind. The sheer kinetic energy from a crash of that magnitude would have completely obliterated the rocky intruder, scattering its remains and violently diluting Jupiter's solid core into the murky soup we are scanning today. Knowing this might be exactly how the gas giant grew into the monstrous king of the planets makes you realize just how fragile our little fleet really is. We are navigating through a graveyard of shattered worlds, hoping we do not share their silent, violent fate. It is a hauntingly beautiful theory, an ancient cosmic collision that birthed a giant. And it makes complete logical sense, but out here in the vastness of deep space, making sense does not automatically mean something is the truth. Before we ever launched the generation ships, astronomers tried to recreate this exact doomsday event using massive supercomputers. They fed the machines endless variables, running countless scenarios with ghost planets of completely different sizes, speeds, and chemical compositions, watching them smash into a young Jupiter over and over again in the digital dark. They wanted to see if the math could actually build the broken, fuzzy core that our ship sensors are currently screaming about. When the first simulation results flashed across the monitors, they saw exactly what everyone desperately wanted to see. The digital impact created a massive, unstable, fuzzy core, but then the simulation kept running and the hope faded. In every single scenario they tested, the chaotic energy would quickly burn itself out. The molten materials would cool, settle back down, and solidify into a perfectly neat, clearly defined ball of rock, right at the center of the planet. But as we look out the reinforced glass at the real Jupiter, looming out there in the freezing vacuum, we know for a fact that it did not settle. It is still a churning, unresolved storm of mixed matter, defying every piece of logic we brought with us from Earth. So here we are, humanity adrift in the great unknown, staring down a colossal planet that simply should not exist the way it does. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jupiter has this massive, inexplicable, bleeding core, but we have absolutely no idea how it got there. For all the centuries of science we accumulated back on Earth, we really have no clear answer on how a beast of a planet like this even forms in the first place. And honestly, you and I both know that is exactly why we left home. The universe is not just a cold, empty void. It is a giant, terrifying, and breathtakingly beautiful mystery begging to be solved. We are the ones who finally stepped into the dark to ask the questions that could never be answered from the ground. We might not have all the answers today as our fleet quietly slips past the asteroid belt and heads deeper into the endless night, but we are a stubborn species. We left the only home we ever knew because the desire to understand the cosmos was stronger than the fear of dying in it. Every scan we run, every bizarre anomaly we record inside Jupiter's crushing atmosphere brings us one step closer to unraveling the mechanics of creation itself. We will keep flying, we will keep studying, and we will learn how to survive out here among the giant planets. The secrets of the solar system are vast and intimidating. But we have all the time in the universe now. We will find the truth eventually, out here in the beautiful, terrifying dark.